Hello, thank you for joining us. My name is Dan Sharp, Vice President of Community Research and Grants Management at the Columbus Foundation. I'm delighted to welcome you to Giving USA 2022. For over 60 years, this publication has expertly compiled America's giving trends. And this year, we will be looking at the giving patterns of 2021 in our region and discussing the economic landscape of early 2022. It's going to be a great program. First, I would like to address some housekeeping items. This event is being recorded and will be shared after the fact on various social media channels. And for those that have registered for the event, you can expect resources will also be shared with you. If you would like to use closed captioning during the event, please look for the closed captioning option on the bottom right of the screen. Click Live Transcript and then Show Subtitles. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists, please do so at any time using the Q&A feature. Audience questions will be taken during our Q&A portions, but again, feel free to submit those at any time. You can also upvote questions that have already been posted. Please use the chat box for any technical difficulties or if you need to reach an administrator during the presentation today. Most importantly, I want to thank you for caring about this data, caring about the details, and caring about your day-to-day contributions to the nonprofit and philanthropic sector. For that, we are endlessly grateful. So next, I'd like to pass the Zoom square to Mike Schmidt, Vice President and Partner for Cramer Associates, to introduce our next speaker. Mike?
Thank you, Dan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Una Osili, a Freumsen Chair in Philanthropy and the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, the world's first school dedicated to increasing the understanding of philanthropy. She also serves as the Dean's Fellow for the Mays Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. Joining her is Dr. Anna Pruitt, the Associate Director of Research at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and the Managing Editor of today's Giving USA, the annual report on philanthropy, which is the longest running annual report on charitable giving in the United States. Thank you both for your expertise and friendship to the Central Ohio philanthropic community.
Well, thank you and good morning all. Welcome to this very exciting morning where we share with you for the very first time the results of Giving USA 2022. Before we begin, I'd like to just start by thanking all of our partners here in the Columbus area, especially the Columbus Foundation for hosting us, but also our Giving USA partners who have worked alongside us tirelessly to bring this report to you, and certainly Mike, Laura McDonald, and so many others, the Hodge Group. I want to acknowledge their contributions as well. This year, we were hoping to do this in person, but it looks like we're going to have to do it virtually just for one more year. But I do look forward to joining you in person, hopefully in the future. And today, I'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So please send in your comments, your questions, your ideas, and also any reflections you may have. This is really a day to acknowledge all the great work that everyone in the philanthropic sector does, and Giving USA does a fantastic job every year of bringing that data to life. And I will do my part, but I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Anna Pruitt, who actually is the managing editor for Giving USA. And we will tag team on this presentation, so you'll have lots of opportunities to ask questions and also share your own insights. So let's go ahead and get right into Giving USA 2022. And you are among the first in the world, I should say, to hear these data from the Lilly Family School colleagues. So we're going to start with the very big picture. Giving USA, as you've heard, is the longest running annual report on charitable giving. Dates back to 1950s. And this is powerful because we can look at where philanthropy has been and also where it's going. We live in turbulent times. As all of us know, we've lived through a global pandemic, an economic crisis of unprecedented proportions, and a once-in-a-lifetime racial and social justice movement. How have Americans responded? We're going to share that data with you today. And so let's start with just the very first slide, which is the big picture slide here, moving to that big picture slide. All right, let's see. Okay, perfect, thank you. All right, so in Giving USA 2022, we're going to share the top line numbers, which all of you probably are just waiting to hear from. The total giving number reached a new record of $484 billion. This is remarkable news considering all of the challenges that many nonprofits have faced. The subtext of today's presentation is really the generosity of Americans of all different backgrounds, but also the resilience and innovation that nonprofits have shown, and many of you in the Columbus area have shown during these times. It's also worth noting that the data points to the power of individuals in American philanthropy, with 67% of all giving coming from individuals. The second largest slice comes from foundations, and we've seen during this time foundations, community foundations, independent and operating foundations, actually stepping up to meet the challenges and the needs in communities, both large and small. Charitable bequests also occupy a larger slice of the pie at 9%, and corporate giving, which has taken on much more visibility in the wake of the racial and social justice movement. We've seen companies, large, small, across various sectors, really responding to the COVID pandemic, but also to racial equity and many other concerns. Now, where did all the giving go in 2021? Giving USA not just tells us who gives, but ultimately the destination of those charitable dollars. And on the next slide, we're going to look at those contributions. And this is one of the pie charts to watch because we do see significant changes in the charitable sector over time. Today, as it stands, religious congregations still occupy the largest slice of the charitable pie, making up 27% of all charitable giving. But I want to emphasize that this share is actually down. In the 1960s, giving to religious congregations was still the largest share, but 2/3 of all charitable dollars went to congregations. However, we are still finding that religious motivations still play a role in the charitable sector, and many donors who attend services frequently and affiliate with religious traditions not just give more to their congregations, but also to other types of charities. The second largest segment of the pie went to educational institutions, and this includes higher ed, but also increasingly K-12 organizations. And I want to mention two areas in philanthropy that have grown very much over time. The environmental sector, there's lots of attention focused on climate and how to protect our environment for future generations. And younger Americans have taken the lead in this arena. So environment now occupies about 3% of charitable giving. We should note that this is a new area, was not actually tracked until 1987. And international affairs, where in recent times we've seen Americans giving to support international causes, including more recently the war in Ukraine and many other global food security and other challenges. Now, just moving ahead, every year our team works through all of the data points, combs through the Giving USA data, literally hundreds of data points, and we have the tall charge of coming up with the top 10 findings, but we don't have all day this morning. We want to leave time for the panel and for lots of discussion. So we've restricted ourselves to just the top 6 findings, and I will share the top 3 and then pass the mic over to my colleague, Dr. Anna Pruitt, who will walk you through the other 6 findings and the other 3 findings. So there'll be 6 this morning. So let's start with the very first one. And this is the one I have been thinking about since we started to analyze this year's data. If we had to say what was the takeaway for Giving USA 2022, it would be that the economy and the social environment continue to influence giving. Americans showed remarkable generosity in light of so many of these challenges. Many in the nonprofit sector wondered if donor fatigue would set in, but we're here to share that actually Americans continue to give, and in turn, the economy bolstered that response, that generosity response. So let's look at the data. And there's also a sign here, some hopeful signs, I would say, looking ahead, that we will continue to see this generosity persist. Why do I say that? Well, we've been able to look over time at giving trends. And what we've noted is that recessions do not necessarily have to lead to a decline in giving. I just want to point out 2020 was a very turbulent economic year, but we did have a significant contraction in the economy and still giving persisted. So you've seen one recession, and we've also seen that during recessions, some households may not be in a position to give, but many are still in a position to give quite generously. So as we look at the economy in 2021 and peel back the layers there, on the next slide, I just want to share with you what those results tell us. Our team has gone back several decades to try to capture a moment like this one, where the economy is facing several challenges, not just inflation, but also rising oil prices in particular. And in the 1970s and 80s, we did have this sort of challenge that emerged. What we did see in the 80s is that individuals were still the largest slice of the pie, as they are today. But what has changed is that foundations are playing a bigger role than they did. In other words, foundations now occupy 20% almost of all giving. However, within this data, I want to emphasize still the power of individuals. If we were to take the individual segment, add the charitable bequests, and take half of the foundation segment, which is family foundations, we would have 88, 89% of all giving still attributed to individuals. So as you think about your strategies and the roles that you play as a donor, as a nonprofit leader, as a fundraiser, connecting with individuals, building relationships was the case in the 1980s and is still the case today. Now let's take one step further and just summarize very quickly on the next slide where the economy stands in 2021, where it stood in 2021, and what this means for us in 2022. So first of all, we had a very strong economic and financial environment in 2021. It's worth emphasizing that GDP grew at over 5% adjusted for inflation. This is remarkable, and actually, if you look at the data, a very strong year in comparison to any other year that we've looked at in this decade. In addition, financial markets grew also at record rates, growing at 21%. And this factor probably was a very significant indicator as we look ahead. So if I had to say, what should you watch going forward? Certainly look at the stock market, because that drives a lot of large gifts and a sense of financial and economic security for many Americans. However, there was a dampening effect as we continue to look back, but also look ahead. Inflation grew at close to 5% in 2021. This is unprecedented. In fact, we've had very moderate inflation in recent years. And if you've been following the economic news, you'll know that inflation has persisted in 2022. So it's something that nonprofits are going to have to watch, not just because it affects fundraising and how consumers feel, but also for many nonprofits, this affects their cost of doing business and delivering services. Now, as we move to the next slide, I just want to share very quickly, as I mentioned, if you had to pick one economic indicator to watch, certainly pay attention to all of them, but pay attention to the stock market, because we've seen that this is very closely linked with charitable giving, and especially large gifts, which are significant in this economy. Now, as we move to the next slide, I'd just like to point out that there's so many findings that we can lift up today, but the second most important finding as we look at the data is that generosity persisted in 2021. This is really good news because we had a remarkable year in 2020. And as we looked at the 2021 data, we weren't sure what we would find, but across the board, we saw donors, high net worth donors gave at very high rates. In fact, in this year's data, we were able to bring our Bank of America study, which was launched in 2021, and we found that American households, high net worth households, gave at record rates. Not just their participation rates, but the average gift size actually grew by about 40%. On the next slide, I'd just like to share that this giving is very broad-based. It's across all racial and ethnic groups. One point that I think we should all celebrate today is that when we look at the data, we see that Americans of all backgrounds engage in philanthropy. Generosity knows no race or ethnicity. And this is really good news because we're used to, at this point, talking about how we need to really start to think about dismantling these systemic disparities that we see in the data. But when it comes to generosity, we see it across the board. So on the next slide, I just want to emphasize that when we look at high net worth households and who gives, and we have significant data over time, we see high rates of giving across the board, across African-American households, Hispanic, Asian American, Caucasian, across all types of divisions that are present in our society. Giving is one of the areas where we see everyone participating. And as we look across all of these different indicators, I think this is really good news. And this is something that we should certainly continue to build on. All of us in the nonprofit sector can play a role in building a more inclusive and a more diverse nonprofit sector. So as we move to one more slide on this, in this segment of our findings, I also want to point out one challenge in the data. At the Lilly Family School, we've been tracking the fraction of Americans who give. At the beginning of the 21st century, it was 2/3 of Americans that gave, and it was a very stable number. It did not change during recessions. In fact, we thought at that point that giving was recession-proof. However, at the time of the Great Recession, so around 2008, we started to see those participation rates decline, and they have stayed actually in that pattern over time. Today, on the wake of the global pandemic, we found that less than half of Americans were donating. So if I had to pick a call to action for all of us in the nonprofit sector at this presentation today is what would we all have to do differently to shift this number to make sure that in the future, Americans continue to give and that the giving environment continues to be as inclusive and as broad-based as possible. Now, finally, just one point of conclusion in terms of the third finding. Another piece of good news from Giving USA 2022, as we look at the data, is that we are seeing new models emerge. Donors are giving in new ways, and their motivations for giving are also changing. So this is by far not a static picture, but actually a very dynamic giving environment. So let me share those data points very quickly and then hand it right over to my colleague. So let's go to the next slide. When we look at all of the giving sources, all of the ways that Americans give, we found that corporate giving showed strong growth, actually. And this is in part because corporations had significant corporate profits and a very strong economic environment. We found that corporations were giving in proportion to their values. So this idea of purpose emerged, many companies giving with intent and in areas, and also speaking out against social issues. So the rise of corporate giving, but also corporate voice as we think about a lot of the social issues of our time. When we look at individual and foundation giving, we also saw growth, but when we take inflation into account, both sort of held steady, I guess, is the big picture. The only segment of charitable giving that declined was the bequests. Now, when we take all of this together, giving grew at 4% and adjusted for inflation stayed relatively flat or held steady. This is really good news because we had a remarkable year in 2020. But that's not the only point I want to emphasize. Foundations also experimented with new models, providing unrestricted grants to their nonprofit partners, and also experimenting with trust-based philanthropy, where reporting restrictions were, I'd say, foregone. Many funders actually allow their grantees to develop their own narratives and their own reports. And we also saw corporations using new models, impact investing, and new forms of community partnerships. So there's really, I think, a sense that this is an inflection point in our data. We're seeing not just that giving is growing across the various segments that we're emphasizing, but beyond the growth, there's also an expansion in how funders are thinking about supporting the causes that matter to them and their nonprofit partners. So just a couple of additional slides on the sources of giving. On the next slide, I just want to share one quick data point. Let's see, yes. Okay, so what made a lot of the new models possible, not just the COVID pandemic, the idea that funders wanted to allow their nonprofit partners the opportunity to be flexible and respond to the changing demands in their communities, but also the rise of the racial and social justice movement. And as foundations and corporations saw strong growth in the financial and economic indicators, there was also an opportunity to expand the ways that they supported their nonprofits, partners, and grantees. Now, this especially is good news heading into, you might say, the next couple of years, because foundations do tend to give out of a 2 to 3 year rolling average. So the growth that we've seen in the economy, and especially in financial markets, should bode well for both foundation and corporations going forward. They're coming from a strong place coming out of 2020 and 2021, especially on the financial market side. And just one last point on this idea of new models and new approaches. One of the questions we get asked often is, will this interest in unrestricted giving continue? And will this turn towards trust-based philanthropy persist? And I think all of us have a role to play in building a stronger philanthropic sector. Nonprofits can build trust by providing transparency and accountability around their outcomes and around how they use some of their financial resources. And then just one more slide, and I'll turn it right over at this point to my colleague, Dr. Anna Pruitt.
Thank you so much, Una. So Una's done a wonderful job of explaining to us what the landscape of giving looked like and what the results were for the main sources of giving. So now these final findings are going to cover what happened over on the recipient side for those nonprofit organizations that received all this funding. So when we go to the next slide, we'll get to our finding number 4, which is that most subsectors grew in 2021. 7 of the 9 recipient subsectors increased in current dollars. And there were a lot of really encouraging recovery stories in 2021. In particular, giving to arts, culture, and humanities grew by 27.5% in 2021, which is more than any other subsector. This was particularly encouraging after a 5.6% decline in 2020. And when we think about why we're seeing these results, well, we know a big part of it is the fact that giving to arts is linked to stock market performance. So that strong growth in the S&P definitely had a positive effect here. But we also see a similar recovery in health, which grew 7.7% in current dollars after about a 5.7% decline in 2020. Now, for both health and arts, a return to in-person events also helped to support growth in these areas. So for instance, in health, a study of the top 30 peer-to-peer fundraising events, which are those walkathons, bikeathons, swimathons, etc., that support large health organizations, found that peer-to-peer events grew by $922 million in 2021 as compared to 2020. There's a great example right here in Ohio that I wanted to make sure to highlight in the Pelotonia, which is a bike event hosted by the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center. Probably all of you are familiar, which saw an increase of 143% according to this report. And not only did the dollar amount go up, but there was a broader range of participation than ever, with more than 10,000 individuals helping to fundraise for the organization in some capacity, whether that be as someone who's participating in the writing event or someone who's volunteering. or someone who's doing a combination. So really, really exciting findings here. And I think, as Una was saying, a real testament to the innovation that we see in this sector. Now, on the next slide, we can see there are some organizations that grew in both 2020 and 2021. So for instance, Public Society Benefit experienced 23.5% growth in 2021 after a strong 2020. Now, Public Society Benefit is a bit of a catch-all category. It includes United Ways, Jewish federations. It includes any kind of legal aid organization. So the ACLU is here, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is here, and lots of those types of organizations, all of which received a lot of attention in both 2020 and 2021. What's also counted here are our national donor advised funds, such as Fidelity Charitable, Schwab Charitable, et cetera. So this category has a lot of those important pass-through organizations that support many different types of nonprofits. Giving to the environment also grew for a second year in a row in 2021 at 11%. It is right now our smallest category of giving, but we're seeing tremendous strides in this area, tremendous growth over time. So we're very excited to see how that persists moving forward. Now, on the next slide, we can see this is showing all of the subsectors all together. You'll notice we have both current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars. And what you can see when you look at the full picture is, first of all, due to that higher inflation rate, as Dr. Osili just mentioned, the picture can look a bit different. And there are a handful of subsectors that experienced mixed results, with 1 year that was positive, 1 year where there were some struggles. However, when we look at the combined growth over 2 years, even when we adjust for inflation, we're seeing a positive picture, with 7 of 9 subsectors experiencing growth. So that means giving for the vast majority of these nonprofit organizations is over what it was before the pandemic, which is, I think, very heartening. On the next slide, we're going to move right into finding number 5, which is that some charitable subsectors faced complex terrain. So the next slide shows us some of those more mixed pictures. And I think it's really important here to emphasize that while some sectors did see declines in 2021, that's in comparison to all-time highs in 2020. So for a handful of organizations that experienced this, we have human services. We know that there was an incredible outpouring of support in 2020. Now, we didn't see growth rates quite as high in 2021. Does that mean that giving cratered? Absolutely not. It just means that it didn't reach the incredible heights that we saw the year before. It's a similar picture for education. And I just want to emphasize here that we're seeing so many heartening and exciting trends in these 2 subsectors, including a move from grassroots type philanthropy to more institutionalized philanthropy. So for instance, in human services, we have a great example of community fridges, which are a grassroots organizing principle wherein people kind of have a public refrigerator that they can leave food in or get food from. And it used to be organized primarily by neighborhoods in a more informal way. We saw in 2021, Whirlpool actually partnering with Boys and Girls Clubs in order to make more of these community fridges accessible to more people. So that's a really exciting example of how the great outpouring of support and the many different types of philanthropy that we saw in 2020 actually grew in 2021 and expanded in certain ways. So even though there are maybe some subsectors didn't reach that height that they did in 2020, that doesn't mean that we're seeing giving crater. It's still a very positive 2-year picture for all of these organizations. Now, moving on to our final finding, technology is expanding opportunities for philanthropy. So on our very next slide, we can actually see the share of giving that is coming from online sources. And as you might expect, there was a big giant jump from 2019 to 2020, with online giving representing about 13% of the total in 2020. Now it had been going steadily up over time, then it jumped forward in 2020. And again in 2021, it didn't reach quite those heights, but it's still significantly higher than it had been. And so I think that we're interested to see how this is going to play out in the future. And then finally, we just want to highlight some of the exciting items going forward that I'm sure that will be discussed in the coming discussion. And that is that nonprofits are just going to have to keep navigating this ever-changing terrain. That happened in 2020. It happened again in 2021. We expect that it's going to continue to be happening in 2022. Flexibility is really the name of the game. Additionally, we know that new ways of giving are incredibly popular. So not only do we have donor advised funds, but we also have things like cryptocurrency. We saw a real uptick of giving in cryptocurrency in 2021, and we're curious to see how that plays out going forward. And then finally, we know that technology is playing an incredibly important role. There's many different organizations that are now working with hybrid events. Instead of saying, okay, that's something that only happened in 2020, there are many organizations that saw there can be some real benefits to having, for instance, hybrid fundraisers. And how can we take advantage of those things? So we know that moving forward, technology will be increasingly important. So that wraps up our presentation and the top 6 findings. Of course, we have a lot more to say, and we're eager to hear what all of you have all of your questions, and we are happy to answer those.
Good morning. My name is Marcy Williams, and I'm with the Ohio Association of Nonprofit Organizations, and I will be introducing today's panelists. Dr. Amy Acton, President and CEO of Rapid 5, a new nonprofit being created to champion Rapid 5, a movement dedicated to connecting Central Ohioans to nature and one another through the region's 5 major water parks and the parks and trails along them. Janet Chen, CEO of Pro Musica Chamber Orchestra, leading a team of 8 and the orchestra of 37 professional musicians from all over the country who make Columbus their musical home. Brad Draper is a Senior Vice President of Operations at Mid-Ohio Collective, where his team manages a network of more than 600 partners across 20 counties, as well as direct customer outreach and food distribution. And PJ Gamble, Senior Director of Development at Sprout 5, a Columbus-based nonprofit that uses early education as a driver for community development. And finally, our moderator, Laura McDonald, CFRE Principal and Founder of Benefactor Group. A certified fundraiser since 1999, she founded Benefactor in 2000 to serve the needs of those who serve the common good. She currently serves as the board chair of the Giving USA Foundation.
Great. Thank you, Marcy, and thanks to everyone for being here today. I know that there are some questions coming through in the Q&A, and we'll be sure to get to those as well. But first, I want to dive into the data a little bit and talk about the lived experience that organizations had. So I'll start with you, Janet. I know that we have the good fortune of working with a lot of groups in arts, culture, and humanities, and we're delighted to see the rebound in giving this year. Does that match with what you experienced or what you're hearing from your peers?
Thank you, Laura, and good morning to everyone. First of all, it was really encouraging news to hear, particularly as many arts and cultural organizations, I think, are still feeling the impact of the decline in earned revenue and ticket sales and membership sales. Obviously, this is a significant residual of this pandemic time. Certainly, Pro Musica is also grappling with that as well. So while I would say that we haven't necessarily seen the equivalent of a 20+% rebound in giving to ProMusica, I would say that for us, and what I'm hearing from some of my peers locally, is that supporters have been very generous and there has been stability. I guess in a time when the only constant has been change, this is very encouraging to remain stable. And I would say stability even throughout 2020 and into 2021. A couple of factors that come to mind that could attribute to the rebound and the stability is, for example, seeing donations being added to ticket purchases and speaking to the fact that online ways of giving has helped that. We've seen subscribers turning their tickets into donations if they aren't comfortable attending events. I heard the stock market certainly has helped us fare well during this time, but I would also say maybe a less tangible piece is that there is truly, I think, a sense for donors wanting to remain engaged and deepen their engagement, especially as for a period of time, the arts were pretty much dark, theaters were dark, and that's been very important. Organizations like ours, we've had to kind of flex every creative muscle during 2020 and into 2021. We spoke about digital and virtual content now being available at levels that we've never seen before. And I would also just kind of add to some of the findings with regard to digital and virtual content attributing to donations. That has definitely been the case for us, and also I know also locally and nationally. And just two other quick notes that come to mind. ProMusica has seen an increase in giving levels this 2021 year, particularly in individuals and family and private foundations. And also we have seen single one-time major gifts to ProMusica that we have not seen before. And that has really been, again, very encouraging. And finally, I would just kind of speak a little bit to nationally. The League of American Orchestras just had their annual conference a couple weeks ago. And what I heard coming out of that is that moving forward, there's a great sense of optimism for the coming year, especially around mid-level gifts and event support. So hopefully the rebound will continue and continue to grow. But I'm grateful for the stability that this community has given to the arts and culture organizations that I think are so essential to what we do and to the lives of so many here.
Thanks, Janet. And that's good to hear that you've seen that kind of resilience during these challenging times. You know, Brad, it was a little different for human services as we saw after huge growth in from 19 to 20. That leveled off and in fact even declined a little bit in 21, not keeping pace with inflation. How did that seem to affect the Mid-Ohio Food Collective, and did donors to your organization keep up with the community's needs?
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to everybody for hosting this event and for including us in this conversation. We did see that trend in our data, especially in 2020. The human services sector, and particularly those of us who work on the basic needs end of the human services sector, were the recipients of a tremendous generosity in our community to help us get through the pandemic. And so 2020 was really an anomaly, we believe, for us in terms of what happened in terms of philanthropy in our community, both here locally and nationally, in terms of response to that. And what we've seen in 2021 is a decrease in giving, but compared to 2019 before the pandemic, it is an increase, basically splitting the difference between 2019 and 2020, which is encouraging because we came off that philanthropic generosity of the pandemic and have continued to increase above our previous levels. The other thing that complicates our own situation a little bit is that this time period overlaps with a comprehensive campaign that we were conducting to fund several of our key strategic initiatives. above and beyond our traditional operating fundraising. So that does complicate things a little bit, even though we keep the numbers separate, one always impacts the other, and it's kind of hard to suss that out. But we are seeing these trends, and in terms of what's happening now, inflation is really impacting us in several ways. It's obviously impacting our donors, as it is for everybody attending here today. It's also impacting our customers. The dollars that they're spending in the grocery store simply don't stretch as far, and so they're needing to come see us for emergency food assistance. And so our lines are actually about 10% longer right now than they were at the peak of the pandemic. And it's impacting us from a food sourcing perspective, in that when we go out into the market to purchase food, our dollars don't stretch as far. So inflation is kind of a triple-edged sword for us, which I'm not sure is actually a thing, but it works. Yeah, we're dealing with that now, and the community is responding, but we certainly need additional support and continue to work towards that. So thank you.
Thanks, Brad. I think yours is an organization that's going to be really at the front line of the impact of supply chain disruptions and inflation. So thanks for sharing that perspective.
Yep.
PJ, as you saw in 2020, there was huge growth in giving to education, and there was some anecdotal evidence that really reflected a strong interest in equity and access to education. 2021 didn't quite eclipse that high point, but the 2-year growth rate, as you saw, is still 6.8%. So what trends have you seen in contributed revenue, and what's inspiring donors to support Sprout 5?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great question. And again, thank you for having me. I would like to answer that question with yes and. Obviously, 2020 was a historic year. We all endured a once in a generation pandemic. So in addition to that, right, there was a summer of social unrest where we continued to fight for racial justice. So like many of our peers on this panel, we did see a huge giving heart from our philanthropic partners here in the community to really fill in those gaps. We also received a truly transformational gift during this time from a philanthropic group out of Dayton during this time that really kind of helped specifically for our growth and scale. So Sprout 5 did see similar gains in our giving over the last 2 years, as donors really have been excited to support our unique model and our approach to the field. Again, as mentioned earlier, it's our belief that early education truly is the first mechanism to truly drive community development, and many continue to be interested in how we look to address poverty reduction. But I would be remiss if I did not mention that the sector and most of our peers are really continuing to struggle. Early education has been a very fragile institution for a myriad of reasons, right? So 2020 and beyond have really brought these disparities to the forefront. Early educators are leaving the field in droves, which is why we're doing our best to bring equity and dignity to the profession. But to do so, we really need to continue to lean on our donors, right? Both public and private. So there's a caveat to my answer, as a lot of that giving in education, was heavily given early on to higher education institutions. Again, like you mentioned in the report, increasingly to K through 12, but oftentimes early education kind of teeters this line between education and a human service. But one thing's for sure, I think we can all agree that early education is a public good, right? It's a very instrumental and required service for the first critical 5 years of life for our family and our futures. We continue to struggle, right? 2 in 5 families pre-pandemic, right, lived in early education deserts, right? So there's a lot of room to make up in my particular sector. But Sprout 5, formerly Southside Early Learning, really continues to be innovative in what we bring to the table. And that's, I think, what is encouraging for a lot of the donors in our space.
Great, thanks, PJ. And as a mother and now grandmother, I concur with the importance and the difference that it's made in the lives of that journey from 0 to 5. Dr. Acton, Rapid 5 is a brand new organization. In fact, there might be people today who aren't yet familiar with the organization and your cause. Have you thought about the role that contributed revenue will play with your organization, and will this data at all inform that strategy?
Well, thank you, Laura. It is a joy to be here with everyone. As always, in past life, I helped do the Giving USA presentation, and I'm learning so much today that will definitely from my colleagues and this report. I just want to share briefly, Rapid 5 is becoming a brand new nonprofit. It actually sprang out of a visioning phase that occurred during the pandemic. And as we all know, and I can attest, nature was the one place that we could all go safely, not only to get the health benefits of it, but also to be with one another. And so at heart, Rapid 5 is about connecting our region to nature and one another like we've never done before. This visioning phase was the product of philanthropy and many sectors coming together, the Urban Land Institute, our regional planning, but it was also foundations and universities and cities. And the vision is profound. It's creating the largest integrated park system in the country. We are currently benchmarking other systems like the Atlanta Beltline, the High Line in New York, and we're going back to the old cities like the creation of Central Park. We're looking around the world. So what we imagine forming, like was mentioned, Pelotonia in this presentation, we are imagining creating a catalytic convening organization. We are not the doers, we are not the implementers. In fact, we have so many community partners, especially our nonprofit partners, that do the programming and the activities. We have metro parks, we have over 80 jurisdictions that could each own a section of our 5 major riverways. We do not have mountains, we do not have oceans, but we do have these gems that have been lying hidden in plain sight. And what I love about this project is that while we lead with recreation and joy and something that we have all found common ground in a time where that is hard to find, underneath it is public health. It is an economic development engine of attracting workforce, but it's also small business creation. It is education. It is environmental stewardship, really taking care of the ecology. It is health and well-being. Ultimately, all the community thrives when we create the conditions collectively. And so our model will be based on an operational budget that we hope to have a couple key partners so that when we do raise funds, we are actually raising it for the community, for the cities, for the nonprofits doing the work. So that is the model we're looking at.
Great, thanks, Amy, and it's an exciting new development for our community. So none of you spoke specifically about corporate support. And we know that corporate giving grew dramatically, although it didn't grow quite as much as corporate pre-tax profits. And it now represents just 0.7% of corporate pre-tax profits nationally. And yet we know we have many very generous corporate partners here in Central Ohio. Janet or others, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about what you're seeing, and Brad perhaps at Mid-Ohio Food Collective or PJ at Sprout 5. What are you seeing in the way of corporate support for your missions?
So I can jump in first. We are continuing to see very generous support from our corporate partners here in Central Ohio. And the info that I received from our development team is that for the 2021 and the first half of 2022, almost each year, our corporate giving has increased about 2%. So probably not quite keeping up with inflation, but it has continued to increase. So thank you.
Janet?
Yeah, I can chime in. I think for music and I think anecdotally for the arts, the corporate support, we have incredible, generous corporate supporters, but we haven't been able to grow that. We are consistently looking at some of the new corporations that are making Columbus their home and how we can engage. But certainly with so many needs in the community, and especially with all the challenges over the last 2 years, we've seen corporate giving shift for us. So I think the narrative is, how do we ensure that the arts and culture and humanities remain relevant and, in fact, essential. All the behind the scenes work that artists and creatives do to, work towards helping some of these challenges in the community is really key. And one other factor that plays into this is there is some significant corporate support that goes towards events. So galas, benefits, and the last couple of years, many of us have not been able to do that at the levels that we have done in pre-pandemic times. There's going to be a shift there, I believe. So I think that journey in terms of partnering with corporate supporters will be a little bit of a different era, and how do we adjust and continue to work with the generosity of these corporations.
And yep, absolutely. And I'll chime in as well. Historically, as we existed as Southside Early Learning, right? We didn't lean on corporate partners traditionally, but we are moving forward in kind of a different era in our existence. And as Sprout 5, we have been really engaging our corporate partners. As I kind of mentioned in my first answer, we did receive a transformational gift from our friends down in Dayton with the Cramer Group and the Kids and Community Partners Foundation. And so a lot of corporate partners are really, really interested. So a lot of what my peers have said here on this panel, it remains true. There have been some opportunities that are lost with things like events, but they are still finding ways to really rally and support in other ways, right? Innovation is something that our partners are continuously trying to find ways to do. I think the other thing about corporate partners too, I think through 2020, I think a lot of priorities shifted recently, right? So some where we might have been receiving, education dollars from one organization might have had a bit of a tweak in, more of an interest in supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So that, that a lot of corporate partners also took a moment to kind of reset and kind of reframe how they were going to give moving forward. And so I think that also has impacted a lot of our nonprofits here locally.
PJ, I've noticed that too, that corporations have kind of refocused their giving, but a lot of what we see, particularly with the arrival of Intel, is that they're very interested also in workforce development. And let's face it, you're at the very beginning of that pipeline of producing great citizens who can contribute to our economy and our communities. I want to push on, Brad. Did you have something quick to add to the corporate question? I
was just going to quickly add, I mentioned in my first answer that we were simultaneously running a comprehensive campaign, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that corporations were a real driving force in the success of that campaign, in addition to their steady support for our operations. So just wanted to throw that out. Thanks.
They certainly were. We got to see that firsthand. Dr. Acton, we've talked some about the sources of giving: corporations, individual foundations. But the report also focuses on the 9 recipients. We divide it into 9 different sectors. Where does Rapid 5 fall amongst those causes that we report on?
Well, thank you. I am so struck right now by the opportunity for weaving together. This came up in the report, fundraising across sectors and across our issues, the partnering of nonprofits. I feel, and this goes to your corporate question as well, that having larger narratives, and we are at a moment of opportunity in this community. We know we're growing tremendously. And what we are trying to do at Rapid 5 is help us grow well. And that, our project has layered in it arts. It has outdoor venues for new pop-up food pantries in neighborhoods. It has educational outdoor classrooms to be in. And so I find that I'm very fortunate in this nonprofit that not only we're looking at state and federal dollars and corporate dollars and other resources, but we actually might have the opportunity to raise money for our partners to do that great work in new settings, to have that art installation or outdoor concert. So I think it'll be very exciting. I think folks are looking for us to weave a narrative, especially in a time of such unremitting duress that we have been through, of a new way of life. And this community is really poised and great at partnering. So that's what I look forward to. And I just see that opportunity everywhere. But we have to have a shared narrative of a new way of life.
Good, thank you for that.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to, what Dr. Atkins said just inspired something that it is very true, I think, of Columbus, that while we're in different buckets with regard to, the categories, the nonprofits here and the funders that fund our nonprofits, the dollars go deep and across all the buckets. So Pramuska, I'm looking at PJ, this year we're doing a collaborative program, music on infants and toddlers. It's a brand new program, and the corporate funding and the support for that really crosses all sectors. And I think that just wanted to kind of highlight that, even though we're looking at the different categories, the funding is spread wide and well.
Well, as long as we're talking about this sort of egalitarian aspiration, I do want to touch on something that the data suggests, and that is that so much of charitable giving is coming, in addition to corporations or foundations, is coming from high net worth households in particular. And I wonder if that aligns with what you've seen, and or if there are any things that you're doing to try to broaden the appeal and democratize philanthropy, if you will.
I'll jump in here because Sprout 5 saw probably 271 new donors over the course of last year. And that was really, driving home a small dollar campaign, right? We're, in the month of November, I know alone we raised probably $70,000 just selling, kind of not selling, but offering cookbooks as an incentive to drive fundraisers. They really engage that small donor population. So yes, the higher worth or high net worth donors still kind of driving, the bulk of our donorship, but at the same time, we are really trying to find ways to engage everyone across the spectrum of giving, and really continue to make sure that we are building a pipeline of givers.
Good, thank you for that. I think it's an important work, and sometimes we focus on those big gifts, and Mackenzie Scott gets the headlines, and that's fine. But I think to also understand, I know when we were working, Brad, with the Ohio Food Collective at the end of, through 2019 and 20, we saw gifts of $1,200 at about the same time that stimulus checks were being released. So clearly, everyday households that realized they were in a fortunate position, gifts of $300 at the end of the year, back when we had the universal tax deduction, which we're fighting for again.
Exactly. The generosity of 2020 was widespread across our community with a significant increase in individual donations. And so our job now is to continue to cultivate those donors through direct mail and online giving and social media and all the channels that we all are familiar with now. So that's what our team does. So.
Yeah, and similarly, we spoke a little bit about, I spoke a little bit about, adding a small donation to your ticket order, rounded up by $5, $10, $15, $25. That definitely attributed to increasing gifts, but also new gifts. The advent of digital content helped us with that. In 2021, we had 100 new donors, and 12 of those were from 12 states they represent 12 states outside of Ohio. I had to say that correctly. Yeah. So you're just thinking about your market reach, expanding with your digital content and then resulting in new donations. That's something we're keeping an eye on.
Good. Well, in a moment, we're going to turn it over to Michael Corey, who's going to facilitate all of us responding to the welcome questions that are showing up in Q&A. So thanks to those who have submitted those questions. And as we get ready for that, I just want to say that I'm particularly proud that Giving USA this year will introduce a new chapter on donor advised funds, giving to and giving from. It now represents about 6% of all philanthropic activity. And so we feel it really warrants a permanent place in the annual report on philanthropy. While Michael gets ready to curate some of these questions, just quickly, do any of you have experiences, and have you seen an uptick in your receipts from donor advised funds?
I know at Sprout 5, we are definitely seeing a small uptick in the donor advised funds in particular. So we are definitely seeing them come in and look to engage them in different ways as well.
Great.
Yep. Similar experience at the Food Collective. We are seeing an uptick in those funds. I don't have an exact percentage, but it is certainly increasing.
I think we should all anticipate that it will continue to increase. Michael, what are we being asked from the audience? And I know that Dr. Osili and Dr. Pruitt are going to join us now as well. And let's have a great, robust conversation.
Thank you all so much. We've received a number of good questions. I'm going to try and consolidate and ask a couple here that reflect the theme and tone of both the morning as well as the mood of the questioners. The first, I think, is eligible for response from any or all of you, and it is essentially, how do we prioritize our missions needs in the eyes of donors when, frankly, the world has become, and I'm going to rewrite this more euphemistically, a very difficult place where everyone needs help right now, especially as a smaller organization. How do we stand out from the crowd? I would defer to any of you that want to tackle that difficult question.
If I may, I'll jump in and then invite others to as well. But I think I would reframe the question a little bit. And so I wouldn't focus on your agency's needs or your organization's needs. I would be focusing on the needs that you're meeting in the community and making the donor the agent of change. So it's not that when you make a gift to Sprout 5, PJ and his colleagues set a child off on a wonderful learning journey. It's your gift helps a child learn to read during those formative years. So those are two things I'd say. It's not about your organization's needs. It's about the very real needs in the community. And it's about making the donor or the community of donors the agents of change. I don't know if others have.
No, I wholeheartedly agree, right? I think it's an opportunity to drive home some of the other things that we do outside of the classroom, right? Janet's touched on it a little bit, right? Bringing enrichment to our littles is one of those things, right? How we close the gap with families, provide warm handoffs through our family resource center. Those are things that we can really highlight and really kind of talk about in a different way outside of just the school that we operate on Monday through Friday. So yes, making the donor agent of change is something that we have really trying to lean into moving forward.
I would just like to add one thing. I know that this is a time of a lot of economic uncertainty, but I also want to remind all the nonprofits joining us that this is also a time where donors are looking for opportunities to make significant change. And many see this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually make a transformational commitment and a gift. So don't think of yourself as just one of many nonprofits. Think of yourself as in a unique position to partner with donors. We are also seeing an important trend that funders are looking for grassroots organizations because during the pandemic, many of them were able to meet and respond in real time to the changing needs of community members. And so small organizations can actually raise their hand and say, we have the capacity to deliver. And many funders, foundations, corporations are actually on the lookout for those small grassroots organizations. So don't count yourself out, but instead count yourself in. And I think this is a moment where it's not just that there's unprecedented need, but there's also unprecedented generosity.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? It's hard to follow that answer. The next question, shifting gears slightly, is for the Giving USA folks. Individual philanthropy shrunk from 2/3 of American households to less than half in 2018. Have you looked at rates of poverty in American households, and could there be a correlation to lower total household capacity to give?
I would be happy to start, but invite my colleague, Dr. Anna Pruitt, to jump in and others as well. So at the school, we have been following this for more than a decade, as I noted, and we've been able to disaggregate how much of that decline is due to economic factors, how much of it is due to other factors. And about 40% is due to declines in income and also wealth and other economic factors, but at least half of it is due to other factors. And I want to emphasize the decline in trust, especially for younger Americans. And one point to take away here is, although nonprofits can't affect the macroeconomy, they can affect the relationships they build with donors. And that component of trust requires transparency, accountability, and ongoing communication with donors. So especially where we look into the future and we do see continued economic uncertainty, I think this is the time to really lean into building trust with donors and sharing broadly what your nonprofit is doing, what you're succeeding at, but also what your challenges are as well.
I would just like to briefly add to Una's very thorough answer that one of the things that we see, one of the things we always say at the school is time, talent, and treasure, and then increasingly the fourth one, which is testimony. So there's many different ways that constituents can become involved in your nonprofit. And one of the things that we see in one of the reports that we use in Giving USA is that the click-through rate for advocacy emails is 20%. That is bananas. If you're familiar at all with email click-through rates, they're normally less than 1%. So what we're seeing here, even in 2021, where nonprofits are doing more outreach than ever, donors are getting more emails than ever, folks that are maybe not donors, but just interested in the work you're doing are getting more emails than ever, we see a high level of engagement. And one of the things that we know is that when people become engaged as volunteers, they're more likely to be donors. So building those relationships is incredibly important. As Una has said, it's about increasing trust and giving people the opportunity to be engaged in many different ways, knowing that maybe right now they can't make a gift, but that's not always going to be true. And it's important to give people that opportunity.
Thank you both for those answers. The next series of questions were about some of the new ways of giving. So I'm going to try to consolidate it thusly. Could you explain a little bit more about the new ways of giving, such as the donor advised funds, but also there were several questions about cryptocurrency, and I would suggest they were questions with a hefty dose of skepticism, given their volatility and why nonprofits should embrace those.
So something to remember is that cryptocurrency is an asset class, which is to say it's a stock. It's like a stock. So not every small nonprofit is going to be set up to receive funds from them. And I don't think that that should be the expectation. There's a wealth of organizations such as donor advised fund sponsoring organizations, but also the Giving Block and others that basically take cryptocurrency and translate it into funds that can go to a nonprofit that can be more easily accepted. So first of all, I think it's really important to mention that. I don't think it's likely that lots of small nonprofits are going to go through the work to be able to grab a hold of cryptocurrency. And, I think it's also something that we see that those that are accepting cryptocurrency have hard and fast rules around it, just like any other kind of complex donation. It's important to have those policies in place. We talk about all of these issues at length in the Giving USA report. So there is a whole section on cryptocurrency if you'd like to know more about the trends in the Giving by Individuals chapter. And as Laura has already mentioned, but I'll plug it again, we have a new chapter on giving by and to donor advised funds. And it's doing a couple of really important things. One is it's showing the trends of where grants from donor advised funds are going. That's new original research that hasn't been anywhere else. Really exciting. And then in addition, we're tracking trends from around the field. So for instance, one of the things that's showing up in the data from around the field is that giving from donor advised funds, those grants from donor advised funds, we know they went through the roof in 2020 as donors responded to the incredible events of that year. But we're seeing from these largest organizations that giving went up again in 2021. Now, again, that's not every donor advised fund sponsoring organization, but that's the largest of the largest four. And that lets us know that, that's a trend that we should be keeping an eye on. So it's something that continues to be important. If you'd like additional details on that, I strongly encourage you to check out the full report where we have a lot of this deep data and a lot of this analysis in place.
Thank you for that very thorough answer. I'm going to stick with that theme briefly because a new question just came in. Is the growth in individual giving showing to be more large gifts and major donors, or higher quantity of smaller gifts, such as a quick give through Facebook, Venmo, and those sorts of donation opportunities?
One thing I'll say that we have some data from the Fundraising Effectiveness project that showed that those smaller micro donations that are $100 or less went down in 2021 compared to 2020. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. We saw a lot of people responding in 2020 with giving to organizations they may never have given up to before, and making a lot of those kind of immediate action gifts. With that said, we see pretty steady giving in that study for those medium and large scale donors. So that's one study, but that's the finding that we see there. And I also don't want to say that it's without hope. The study also found that of those new donors in 2020, there was a 26.1% increase in donor retention. So there were quite a number of donors that came back again in 2021. And I think to Una's earlier point, this tells us about communication and trust building and how important that is.
Thank you for that. Oh, go ahead, please.
No, I think that is definitely true that fundraisers, nonprofits should keep an eye on the mega giving, because we have seen really very large gifts. We all heard about McKinsey Scott's gifts in 2020. In 2021, we had even larger mega gifts announced by many more individuals. Our Bank of America study, which looks at high net worth donors in particular, as I mentioned, saw average gifts increase by 40%. So very significant increase in this time period. But small donors should not be discounted either. During the pandemic in 2020, Facebook announced that those fundraisers that we all receive invitations of birthdays and so forth, causes on Facebook, raised $6 billion. So that's a very significant amount. And I encourage all of the nonprofits to think about these new digital tools. Another good example is the CDC Foundation. They launched a crowdfunding campaign in 2020. And for the very first time, they had never done this before, raised $50 million in just a month. So as we focus on the mega giving trends, and those are definitely a game changer for many organizations, we're also seeing that the engagement tools available to nonprofits have expanded. And so keeping an eye on those smaller gifts is also important, especially with the new digital tools available.
Before we move on to the next question, I wanted to give our panelists a chance to weigh in anecdotally how you might be experiencing what the good doctor just shared regarding the new ways of giving and some of these smaller gifts that might come in through tools like Facebook or TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and all the other things that I'm not young enough to know about anymore. But PJ, specifically, you mentioned that you and your colleagues received a rather transformational gift recently, but I'm sure you're still also receiving smaller gifts from the community that you serve.
Yeah, I think the vast majority is still kind of engaging that everyday individual. But to your point, right, trying to find ways to continue to capitalize on that that mega donor. What I will personally say is I think the pandemic has put a strain on how we build relationships, right? I think the technology piece that I think we just kind of hit on here is where is an opportunity where we kind of lost a little bit of connection. It makes it easier in terms of cutting out travel and things of that nature. But I think, pre-pandemic, we might have been out to a few more coffees and lunches where, virtual has kind of put a strain on some of the more major donor meetings that I would have taken. So I think those are starting to come back, and we're really excited about those. So I'm happy to re-engage that space. So we've really been kind of focusing in on that average day donor, coming in at a price point that most people can kind of rally behind. We've obviously found ways to offer up incentives or use things as catalysts. Again, I kind of mentioned a cookbook that we put out in November to really highlight our food campaign that we actually partner with Mid-Ohio Food Collective on, in offering all of our children a free breakfast, lunch, and heavy snack through the Roots Cafe there at Reeve Avenue Center, and through their food services. So we really find ways to just re-engage that particular population.
Okay, I'll move on to the next one. Thank you so much for that answer, PJ. How can current donors best help the organizations they support beyond gifts? Now, that does stray a little bit from the philanthropic intent that brought us all here today. But as I'm sure we all know, there can be more than writing a check when it comes to philanthropy and giving and supporting nonprofits. To our panelists in particular, please feel free to weigh in on that question, whether you're new to running a nonprofit or you've been in a nonprofit for some time.
So I'll go ahead and jump in real quick on that, because the 4 T's came up earlier, and time, talent, and testimony are all huge. We are desperately in need of additional volunteer opportunities. I mentioned our demand is up 10% compared to the peak of the pandemic. We can't continue to provide that food without volunteers supporting that work, both at our organization and through our partner agencies. And testimony. If somebody is not able to make an additional gift themselves, if they tell 10 of their friends what a great organization it is and how they appreciate supporting it, that could result in additional gifts. That's absolutely huge. So, thanks.
Anyone else?
I can jump in. I would say that encouraging those in your circles to be advocates for our causes. If there's an organization or a mission or a cause that you love, share the love. I think as nonprofits and those working in our nonprofits, our reach is only so far, and that's where the power of inspiration comes into play for us all connecting to serve a greater good. So, bring a friend to a concert, bring a friend to one of our story times at the library, see the work that we're doing and how it's impacting the littles in our community, and engage in that way. Whether or not they transform into dollars, short or long term, we're spreading the word and making our work even better and more relevant.
Thank you.
I guess
Please go ahead.
I might add, Michael, wearing another hat that I can't say enough. This has been such an unmooring time. And what I noticed, our people are looking, when we trust and advocacy, people are really looking to make meaning and reconnect. They are, no matter how angry or whatever bad day, they're looking for grace, and they're looking for ways to have lives that matter and have meaning and purpose and to belong. So I think that is so much about what just the sinew of these nonprofits and what we can actually do to help heal people in our community. Thank you.
I remember the last Giving USA event that I attended in person, and one of the themes of that session was rage philanthropy. Maybe I think that's going to continue, certainly. Maybe the antidote to many things that you all are dealing with every day and that we're all seeing and experiencing is healing philanthropy, to be not only consistent with the missions of the organizations and trying to help the people that you all are serving, but trying to connect with those that are able to support financially and with the time and talent and other things that have been mentioned today. I think we have time for one more question. And I think the one we will get to is relating to the economy and to supply chain and inflationary issues and among other things. The question is more about the historical trends and how we navigate recessions and inflation in the past. But let me add the spin of, because everything is sort of different and through a different lens right now, given the unique circumstances of 2022, how do you anticipate that we're going to navigate the anticipated recession, the 40-year high inflationary pressure, and the uncertainty in supply chains as both a nonprofit as well as a nonprofit engaging with donors? And how do you talk about that with your potential donors, given the uncertainty that remains before all of us?
I can start, but please, anyone else who wants to chime in. And like many people who care about the nonprofit sector, I have been following all of the news coming out of nonprofits. And I do agree that the challenges of navigating higher inflation rates, supply chain disruptions, but also labor market disruptions, finding qualified volunteers, staffing, all of these things. So certainly a challenging time. But here is the good news. No matter what happens, whether we do face a recession this year or next year, we are actually coming out of a very strong economic year. In 2021 in particular, corporate profits were at an all-time high. Many Americans accumulated savings. Households were able to expand their balance sheets. Their housing values increased. So the recession is, if it is going to show up this year or next year, is going to hit households and businesses in a relatively strong position, especially for those of you who are working with donors. Keep in mind that one recession, you've seen one recession, and some households are going to be more adversely impacted than others. But overall, Americans are in a much better position to weather this storm, and are certainly in a very good position to make good giving decisions, because, as I noted, their balance sheets, their housing values, their retirement portfolios have been strengthened over the last few years. And if you're a nonprofit that depends on corporate support or foundation support, corporations and foundations are also in a pretty strong position after record stock market performance, and for corporate giving, very strong corporate profits. So you should be encouraged by the news, no matter what happens with a recession and the timing of one. We are poised, I think, to weather this storm at least relatively well compared to where we would have been maybe if this had taken place earlier.
The other thing I'd share, Una, and you and Anna have taught us this, is that you talked about the stock market. The S&P 500, for example, does have an impact. There's a correlation with charitable giving, but that correlation is based on year-end performance. So a swoon in the middle of the year or a spike in the middle of the year are far less influential than what the stock market was on January 1 and then how it ended on December 31st. So for those of you who have been perhaps a little bit shaken by what we're seeing in the stock market today, just remember we had the same thing in April of 2020 and came roaring back, and that had a positive impact on giving.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
I'll just say that the current inflationary period, from a food sourcing and other perspectives, our CEO, Matt Habash, has said it's the most challenging time that he's seen in his 38 years in this business. But that's our job. Our job is to figure it out and get through it. And hundreds of thousands of people in Central and Eastern Ohio are counting on us to figure it out and put food on their tables. And so we don't have a choice. As leaders in the nonprofit industry, it's our job to figure it out and come out on the other side in a stronger place. So yeah, thanks.
Well, we're all very fortunate that you all are doing what you're doing and figuring it out, no matter what the world has thrown at you. And it feels like there's been something new thrown at you every other day. So on behalf of our board of directors and the 150 organizations we serve, including most of you, thank you for your work. And my job is now to pass this off, I believe, to the Hodge Group.
Hi, good morning. This is Kim Horton. I'm Vice President with the Hodge Group, and thank you all for being here. I would be remiss if I weren't thanking all of you for all of the work that you are doing in our communities. So thank you so much for that work, and thank you for enhancing that work by being here with us today. I'm here to talk with you about subscribing to our materials that we've supported today through this webinar. This subscription is found by going to this link on this page. I trust that you can go ahead and click on that, Google Giving USA, and you're going to see this banner that is shown on this slide, the Giving USA 2022 now available. Subscribe now brings you to all of the benefits of subscribing. This subscription is not a two-dimensional subscription. You're not going to receive some hard copy material. This is dynamic, it's robust. You have access to webinars on a regular basis. You have access to LinkedIn groups. It really enhances your practice. So if you enjoy this type of information and how it can benefit your practice and your organization and your contribution, of course, to the industry and to the benefit of all for the work that you're doing, I really, really encourage you to please subscribe. It's great value. It's $169 a year, and it's well worth it. Huge return on your investment. So thank you for your consideration. I'm going to kick it back over to Danielle, and she's going to wrap this up for us. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event. I want to say a special thanks to our panelists. This was an information chocked full event. Hopefully you found something beneficial for you today. There was so much for everyone. Thank you to each of our panelists, Dr. Acton, PJ, Brad, Janet. Thank you to Dr. Osili and Dr. Pruitt for your information today. I also want to say a special thanks to our Giving USA board members, the Hodge Group, Cramer Associates, and Benefactor, and to our Giving USA presenting partners, AFP, Owano, the Catholic Foundation, GCAC, the Human Service Chamber, and the Women's Fund. And with that, please have a beautiful rest of the evening, rest of the afternoon even, and rest of the week. All right, take care. Bye-bye.